Owen Barfield, if people don't know, is somebody who was a contemporary of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and he was very influential in that group, that circle called the Inklings. Very, very influential on Lewis, somewhat on Tolkien too. And he had some interesting ideas about humanity's development in terms of its coming to itself, understanding itself, and what the next steps are in our development, both on the individual level, but also on the species level and maybe the societal level as well. And it's just kind of a thing that I don't know if it got much traction at the time, but it feels as though it's relevant now. And I've heard you talk about him and about his idea of original versus what's it called, versus final participation.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So could you just briefly just sketch what that idea is?
Yeah, so like Lewis and Tolkien, Barfield was a philologist, a lover of words. What Barfield realized is that you couldn't just conjure different worlds with different words, like particularly Tolkien was so good at, but that if you used words and understood how they change their meaning across time, they could become fossils of human consciousness, not just the wonderful magic of fantasy. And so Barfield did this, and this led him to realize that words have changed meaning substantially over time, but in a discernible pattern, in a particular way, which he then used to come up with an idea of how human consciousness has evolved or changed over time, by which he means it's the sense of what it is to be human and to relate to others and to the natural world and to the gods has changed. And his idea was that originally, and by this he means about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, because that's the extent to which substantial written works survive. I mean, the invention of writing is itself part of the change of consciousness, so that's the reason for that. But originally, so say in the time of Homer, or say in time of the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible, the oldest traditions in India, the Vedic texts and so on, that he saw that people experienced life and meaning from the outside in, is a way of putting it. So the world was alive, the cosmos was full of vitalities, and the effort of myth and the effort of ritual was to organize that great maelstrom of activity from the outside in order to secure your place in that great flood of meaning. And then this starts to shift. I mean, maybe it starts to shift as people use writing for different reasons, notably for writing down the myths. And if you think about it, that changes the way that you relate to them, because if in an oral culture, it's about being in the right place at the right time with the right group around you. You've probably performed some rituals to get you in the right mood. Mm-hmm. And then the myth, as it were, appears before you from the outside in. When you read, this is you and the text, and the meaning has to spring from within you. The words themselves, are sort of neutral on the page, but they can catalyze meaning in you. And so writing along with other things starts to create this sense that no, meaning comes from the inside out. And that creates a sense of being an individual much more powerfully, which he saw particularly in the significance of Christianity, that Christianity has this idea that there was one person who had become so fully human that they could see with complete transparency the one God, the I am of Jesus, if you like, perfectly reflected the I am of the divine. And so monotheism is born at about the same time as well. And so he sees this participation with life greatly shifting. But he has this extra twist that it always shifts through periods of alienation and loss and concern, anxiety. And because when the old way of understanding starts to fall apart, it creates a crisis. But that can then foster a catalyst or catalyze a new sense of participation. And he thought that we were in a similar time now, and this greatly inspired the Inklings. And so Lewis and Tolkien's efforts were directly both Lewis and Tolkien said this, were inspired by Barfield's analysis.
So to me, it seems as though this description of humanity's development and the development that in theory is to come, it has some resonance with Dante's vision, like in that the journey upward from hell to purgatory to paradise entails a kind of awakening into self-awareness of one's situation and a desire to participate in one's development. You know, like we were said before, some of the punishments of hell are actually similar to those in purgatory, but it's less of a sense of these things are happening to me as opposed to I am a participant in this, in creating something else out of this suffering or difficulty. I mean, do you think Barfield and Dante are talking about similar things, or do you think they're different in that sense?
No, I'm sure they are. I mean, we know that Barfield read Dante because actually Lewis tells us that Barfield and him read the Divine Comedy once a year.
Oh yeah, right.
And it's been pretty conclusively shown now, I think, that aside from explicit books by Lewis that draw on the Divine Comedy, like The Great Divorce, the Narnia Tales, the 7 books of the Narnia Tales correspond to the 7 planetary spheres in the paradise too. I mean, that's kind of a long story, but Michael Wood has shown this, I think, to the vast majority of people's satisfaction now. Now, Barfield himself didn't write so much about Dante, but I think you can see a lot of Barfield's analysis in Dante. And as you say, it's not just that it's the one individual going on this great cosmic journey and being transformed in the process to a new kind of participation, but also that it's just a regular guy doing this trip. You know, he's not a priest,
Right.
He's not a pope. He, moreover, is writing in the vernacular, in Italian rather than Latin, which, you know, would have been quite shocking at the time. He's using poetry to write a kind of new scripture, so receiving a new revelation as well. So there's a huge sense of a new dispensation opening up in Dante, and so a pull from the future to a different kind of participation. So it very much corresponds to Barfield's sense of things.